Brittany knocked on her neighbor's door. Brooke opened it and stared at her classmate in surprise. "Do you have anything to eat?" Brittany asked as she entered the room. "Yes, come in," Brooke offered. They sat at the table, which served as both a lunch and writing table, and Brittany began to eat pasta, telling Brooke about her unsuccessful date. Brittany was a beautiful girl, and there were always guys who wanted to meet her and spend time with her. However, Brittany dreamed of fancy restaurants, expensive cars, and a romantic marriage proposal. Lately, she had started meeting men online, going on dates almost every evening, but no one seemed suitable for her. Even today, she had been on a date with a miser who took her to a cheap diner. As soon as she realized there was nothing more to expect, she ran away. The day before yesterday, in contrast, a rich and generous man had come to the date. However, by the end of the evening, he concluded that he and Brittany were not suited for each other. "Imagine," she said, "he dragged me to a Chinese porcelain exhibition. We walked around looking at vases and plates. He told me something about emperors of the dinosaur era and other nonsense. It was so boring. Then he took me to an art house cinema. Am I so unlucky with men?" Brittany asked, frustrated. "Don't worry, you'll find someone else," Brooke said uncertainly. Brittany sighed and went to sleep in her room. She had to go to college the next day. The professor looked at Brittany hostilely, as if she were to blame for his unattractiveness, weight, and probable loneliness. "You have serious problems with your academic performance. Very serious," he said. "I'm trying my best," Brittany said, making honest eyes and nodding frequently in confirmation of her words. "I don't see that you're trying," he replied. "You're skipping lectures. You probably have more important things to do than studying." He got up with difficulty and approached her closely. His eyes slid over her face and settled lower on the neckline of her blouse. "Maybe we can come up with something?" Brittany exhaled feverishly, thinking about what to do. The prospect of being expelled did not please her. Studying seemed to be the only way to catch on in the city and somehow arrange her life, especially since she did not know what to tell her parents. Summer was approaching, and she was supposed to go home to the village and talk about her academic achievements, but she had none. "You could, for example, start attending lectures," the professor suggested with a shrug. "But I'm afraid, in your case, it's already pointless. I'll have to bring up the issue of your expulsion. Can't we come to some kind of agreement?" Brittany asked flirtatiously, leaning forward slightly and showing off her cleavage. She knew her worth, beautiful, tall, modern, and moderately uninhibited. She had long suspected that the old professor had his eye on her, and judging by his reaction, she was right. "May I invite you somewhere?" the professor asked, blushing. "I agree and completely trust your taste," Brittany breathed out, smiling encouragingly. That was enough to make the man bloom. He bowed his head, revealing his shiny bald head surrounded by sparse hair, and kissed her hand. Neither Brittany nor the professor suspected that two students were standing outside the door, greedily eavesdropping on their conversation. When Brittany left the classroom, the students quickly moved away from the door and went straight to the rector's office, where they spoke with the vice-rector. The vice-rector, who happened to be the wife of the amorous professor, had a confrontation with Brittany and the professor. That evening, Brittany and the professor went to a restaurant and then to his house. The man was confident his wife wouldn't be home for at least another 3 hours. However, unexpectedly, the bedroom door opened, and his wife appeared in the doorway. There was a scandal, shouting, and tears. The professor, looking confused, ran around the room, picking up his clothes. Brittany sat on the big bed, watching this scene in horror. The wife looked at her husband with a mix of hatred and pity. "We've been together for 30 years. Our children have grown up, and you already have 2 grandchildren. Yet, you continue to cheat on me," she said bitterly. "Do I need to remind you who you owe everything to?" She waved her hand in despair and looked angrily at Brittany. "And you're expelled." 2 weeks later, Brittany had been shaking on an old bus for 2 hours. Her neighbor, a perky elderly woman, had been filling the journey with village news. Brittany looked out the window, regretting her decision to accept her friend's offer to spend the summer at her country house. It was impossible to go home. She couldn't imagine how she would face her parents. So, she had called and lied, saying she had passed her exams successfully and decided to stay in the city for the holidays. Now, on the bus, she wondered if she had made the right choice. Renting an apartment in the city was expensive, while the house in the village was free. The bus turned off the road and stopped. An elderly lady pulled some baskets into the aisle, then turned to Brittany and said, "My relative Anthony should be here to meet you. You're new here, so we can give you a ride." Brittany got off the bus, took out her fashionable suitcase, and looked around. People were dispersing in different directions, and the elderly woman was already hurrying towards an old pickup truck. Anthony seemed very attractive to Brittany, around 40 years old, tall, with neatly combed light hair and gray eyes. "So, Auntie, did you visit your grandchildren?" he asked, opening the trunk. "Of course," the elderly woman replied playfully. "I saw my grandchildren and the city." "That's good," the man nodded approvingly, then glanced at the pretty stranger with chestnut curls and green eyes. "Hello. Who are you going to visit in that backwater?" "I came to your area to rest," Brittany replied thoughtfully. "Well, there's nothing to see here," Anthony laughed. His laughter was infectious, and Brittany smiled. "I am quite satisfied with the river and fresh air, and the nature here is beautiful," she said. Anthony agreed. When he learned that Brittany was going to live in Blake's old house, he was surprised. The house had long been uninhabitable. Brittany shrugged helplessly. "Well, I'll manage somehow," she said uncertainly. "I was told there are tools in the barn." Anthony shook his head, loaded her suitcase into the trunk, then opened the back door. "Get in. We'll figure out the house somehow." Chloe kneaded dough for a pie while stealing glances at her quiet children who were building something with Legos on the floor, frowning in concentration. Although Chloe couldn't give birth, she loved her children as if they were her own. She and her husband had adopted a boy and a girl from an orphanage when they were 5 and 3 years old, respectively. Before that, they had tried everything to have their child, from seeing doctors to visiting shamans and psychics, but to no avail. They had given up hope and even considered divorce, with Chloe suggesting that her husband leave her so as not to ruin the life of a healthy man who wanted a family. But he stayed, reasoning that if it wasn't meant to be, they would live together no matter what. Eventually, the idea of adoption was born. Chloe baked pies and meticulously cleaned the house. Despite being a city girl and the daughter of wealthy parents, she was very house-proud. They had moved to the countryside 3 years ago, and in that time, Chloe had fully adapted to rural life. She learned to bake pies, milk goats, feed chickens, and more, skills essential for survival in the village. Suddenly, the dog barked happily. Anthony had finally arrived. A minute later, her husband appeared in the house. He hung up his jacket, walked up to the mirror, and scrutinized his reflection. Chloe was surprised. Anthony had never paid much attention to his appearance before. "You're a bit late," she said, looking at the clock. "It's already 7:30. "Well, a girl from the city came here," Anthony shrugged. "Henry Blake's granddaughter rented out the house for the summer. I gave her and my auntie a lift from the bus stop and helped a little." "She came alone, didn't she?" Chloe asked, wiping her hands with a towel. "Yes, she's a student," Anthony answered indifferently. "Not strange," Chloe shrugged. "Well, let's eat." "Sit down." Anthony quickly washed his hands and sat down at the table. He threw the towel aside and breathed in the aroma of freshly baked cabbage pie. "You're such a skilled hostess," he said, hugging his wife with pleasure. The next day, Anthony came to help Brittany again. He fixed the table and stall and hung a hammock in the yard. "I don't know how to thank you," Brittany said playfully. "We villagers are simple," Anthony said. "Thanks is enough." "You don't seem like a villager," Brittany replied. Anthony laughed and sat on a repaired stool. "You're right. I moved here from the city with my wife and children." Brittany tried her best to hide her disappointment upon learning that Anthony was married. "It would be interesting to hear how you ended up here," she said. Anthony shrugged. "I used to come here every summer to visit my grandmother. Once, an expensive car drove up to our neighbor's house, and a woman, a man, and a little girl got out. They went inside the house. Then the local boys approached me and said, "Hey, this is our street. Get out of here." I grabbed a stone and said if they didn't leave me alone, they'd get it. I threw the stone at them. I wanted only to scare them, but I hit the car and the glass shattered. The boys ran away immediately, and I stood there in shock, like a statue. Then the door of the house opened, and the same girl came out. She looked at the car and asked, "Did you break it?" I nodded. Then her father came out, looked at me, looked at the car, and started yelling. But the girl turned to him and calmly said she accidentally broke it. She said a big dog was running around, and she got scared and threw a stone. Her father looked at her affectionately, patted her on the head, apologized to me, and went back into the house. I started courting that girl. I left wildflowers under her gate every day. One day, I even caught fish in the river and left it on their threshold. Her father, I remember, threw away the fish and scolded me. What kind of joke was that? In the village? Then I decided to write her a love letter and put it in the mailbox. Her mother took the letter out but didn't tear it up and gave it to her daughter. The next day, Anthony came to help Brittany again. He fixed the table and stall and hung a hammock in the yard. "I don't know how to thank you," Brittany said playfully. "We villagers are simple," Anthony said. "Thanks is enough." "You don't seem like a villager," Brittany replied. Anthony laughed and sat on a repaired stool. "You're right. I moved here from the city with my wife and children." Brittany tried her best to hide her disappointment upon learning that Anthony was married. "It would be interesting to hear how you ended up here," she said. Anthony shrugged. "I used to come here every summer to visit my grandmother. Once, an expensive car drove up to our neighbor's house, and a woman, a man, and a little girl got out. They went inside the house. Then the local boys approached me and said, 'Hey, this is our street. Get out of here.' I grabbed a stone and said if they didn't leave me alone, they'd get it. I threw the stone at them. I wanted only to scare them, but I hit the car and the glass shattered. The boys ran away immediately, and I stood there in shock, like a statue. Then the door of the house opened, and the same girl came out. She looked at the car and asked, "Did you break it?" I nodded. Then her father came out, looked at me, looked at the car, and started yelling. But the girl turned to him and calmly said she accidentally broke it. She said a big dog was running around, and she got scared and threw a stone. Her father looked at her affectionately, patted her on the head, apologized to me, and went back into the house. I started courting that girl. I left wildflowers under her gate every day. One day, I even caught fish in the river and left it on their threshold. Her father, I remember, threw away the fish and scolded me. What kind of joke was that? In the village? Then I decided to write her a love letter and put it in the mailbox. Her mother took the letter out but didn't tear it up and gave it to her daughter. A romantic, Brittany clapped her hands. And then? I got many bad grades in school and didn't come back to the village anymore. I stayed at home and studied during the summer. Later, I came to my grandmother's house again, but I didn't see the girl anymore. Years passed, I joined the army, and in the second year of service, I received a letter from my mother that my grandmother had died. At the funeral, a beautiful girl approached me. I looked at her, and it was the same girl. She had grown up and become more beautiful. In short, I fell in love again, but this time seriously. I had one day left before I returned to the army, and I spent it with her. We talked, sat by the river, and remembered our childhood, the fish, the broken car, and my love letter. Anyway, she said she would wait for me to finish my service. And did she? Brittany gasped. Yes, Anthony replied. I finished my service, we got married, and then we adopted children and moved here. Oh, really? Did you adopt kids? You're a saint, Brittany exclaimed. Anthony smiled. Come on. I just always wanted children. He hesitated. Brittany nodded understandingly. That's personal. I understand. Anthony left with a strange feeling of shame and awkwardness. He was embarrassed that he had unintentionally compared his charming guest to his wife, and awkward because the comparison was not in his wife's favor. Brittany, lost in thought, sat in her bedroom that evening. The fact that the handsome Anthony was married and had 2 children was somewhat upsetting. As she was putting on her pajamas, she caught some movement out of the corner of her eye. "Who's there? Come out and show yourself," she called out. There were sounds of rustling, then silence. Brittany felt uneasy. 10 minutes later, Brittany was trying to fix a hole in the fence when Anthony caught her in this activity. "What are you doing?" he asked in surprise. "I'm repairing the fence," Brittany answered a little irritably. "Can you help?" Anthony walked into the yard and agreed to help with fixing the fence. Brittany briefly recounted what had happened, and Anthony laughed good-naturedly. "Your neighbor, old Tom, hasn't been interested in anything like that for a long time. He's beyond suspicion." Brittany protested, insisting that she had heard someone rustling around. Anthony walked up to the fence, leaned into the gap, and beckoned Brittany over with his hand. "Do you see him?" he asked, pointing to a dog. Brittany laughed, realizing her mistake. Anthony decided to nail up the gaps anyway for Brittany's peace of mind. She was grateful, and 5 minutes later, Anthony was hammering away, attaching pine slats to the largest gaps. He felt Brittany's gaze on his back and compared her to his wife once again, and once again, not in his wife's favor. Meanwhile, his friend Jack was looking for him. "Where's Anthony?" Jack asked as he entered the house. "At work, where else would he be?" Chloe replied, surprised, as she set aside her knitting needles and yarn. "Don't you work together? Why all the questions?" Jack scratched his balding head, looking puzzled. "He's not there. I've been looking for him all day. I need permission to get the parts, but I can't reach him." Jack said his goodbyes, hopped on his motorcycle, and leisurely drove down the street, turning his head in search of the familiar blue pickup. Soon, he spotted the truck parked at the gate of an old, uninhabitable house. But the house no longer looked abandoned. The windows were open, women's clothes hung on a line in the yard, and the door was ajar. Jack got off his motorcycle and knocked on the door. Voices and hurried footsteps could be heard inside the house. Anthony opened the door, looking peculiar, disheveled, shirtless, and with his belt undone. Everything became clear without words. Jack, Anthony's friend, did not welcome such frivolity as an exemplary family man. "I need to sign some papers," Jack said, flustered. "I'm going to get the parts. I've been looking for you all over the workshop and I couldn't reach you." "Do you have the papers with you?" Anthony asked irritably. Jack pulled out a folder from his backpack and handed it to Anthony without looking. Anthony signed the papers with a flourish. "What are you doing here?" Jack asked. "None of your business," Anthony said sternly, glaring at his friend. "You didn't see anything, got it?" Jack nodded uncertainly. Anthony reached out, squeezed his hand tightly, and looked meaningfully into his eyes. "Just don't ask about anything, okay? I haven't figured out how it happened yet." Jack had no intention of asking about anything. He felt sorry for Chloe and her 2 young children. He was also disappointed in his friend, and that hurt the most. Days went by, and Anthony's behavior became increasingly strange. He came home late, ate quickly, and silently answered all questions with monosyllabic responses or standard phrases. Chloe couldn't shake a nasty, unexplained feeling and imagined the worst scenarios. She wanted to believe Anthony, but it only got worse. Chloe didn't even notice when Susan, Jack's wife and her friend, came into the house. Susan worked at the library and was very well read, probably considering herself part of the village's intellectual elite. "Hi," Susan greeted Chloe. "You look like you're going to a conference. What are you thinking about?" "About trust," Chloe replied. "How do you think if a man loves, will he deceive?" "Love is often elevated to some absurd level in books," Susan answered, "but even love is not a panacea for deceit. It's a well-known fact that people lie. Those who are honest towards some can be very calculating and cunning towards others. Such is the paradox, my friend. Some deceive under the pressure of circumstances, some for a mere ego boost, and some simply cannot imagine their existence without lies. But not trusting anyone means living in constant stress, looking for hidden meanings everywhere, and exhausting oneself and others with doubts. You cannot love without trust, but if you don't trust, why bother starting a relationship at all? Chloe sighed. Susan's musings added to Chloe's confusion. Perhaps she needed to act simply, talk to her husband heart to heart, and then see what would happen. However, the conversation never took place. Chloe discovered her husband's infidelity by seeing it with her own eyes. After talking a bit more with her friend, Chloe saw her off and, glancing at the clock again, dialed her husband's number. He was unavailable once more. Without much thought, she left the house and walked down the street. People were heading towards her, some from the farm, some from the sawmill, and some from the machine shop. "Hi, Jack. Do you know where Anthony is?" she asked. "How would I know?" Jack became nervous and looked away. "Am I his supervisor?" "Don't be so vague," Chloe pressed. "I can see that you're hiding something." "I'm tired." "I'm going home," Jack said, turning away quickly and hurrying down the street. Chloe watched him for a while before heading towards the river, where Blake's house was located. Approaching, she saw her husband's car at the beginning of twilight and the light on in the house. No longer hoping for anything good, she peered through the windows. Her husband was embracing and kissing a young stranger who was practically unclothed. Chloe felt as if someone was choking her but managed to control herself. She opened the door and entered the house. Upon seeing her, Anthony froze and Chloe looked at him disdainfully before leaving. She practically ran down the street, trying with all her might not to cry. The sound of an engine was heard behind her. "Chloe, wait. Listen," Anthony called, leaning out of the car window. He looked pitiful, his hair disheveled and his eyes frightened. "Wait, let me explain." Chloe stopped, turned to him, and crossed her arms over her chest. "Explain," she demanded, squinting. "Well, try to explain." "I don't even know how it happened," Anthony mumbled. "I lost my mind, made a mistake. It happens. Please forgive me." Chloe wanted to hit him. She probably would have if there weren't people on the road casting curious glances. "Let's talk at home," she said tersely and walked down the road. Anthony slowly followed. "Get in the car," he asked. "It looks strange. I'm driving and you're walking. Think about what people will say. Is that all you care about?" Chloe replied bitterly. They covered the entire path home in the same manner. She was on foot, and he was driving. At home, Chloe sat on the sofa and quietly cried. She didn't throw stools or smash plates, but these quiet tears were more frightening to Anthony than any screams or scandals. "Let's forget about this," Anthony pleaded again. "Do you want me to go to her right now and tell her that there's nothing between us? Do you want me to say I love only you?" "Yes, I want you to pack your things and leave," Chloe sobbed. "I'm not interested in where you go, whether to her or anyone else." "I won't pack anything," Anthony frowned. "Then I'll help you," Chloe shrugged. She opened the closet door, and within 5 minutes, Anthony's suitcase was filled with his clothes. "Take your things and leave," she said firmly. Anthony walked out of the house with his head down. He drove to the end of the street, stopped at Jack's house, and honked. His friend came out immediately as if expecting him. Jack looked at the suitcase in the back seat and sighed sympathetically. "She kicked you out?" Anthony nodded and pulled out cigarettes, handing one to his friend. They smoked in silence. "Well, I was thinking," Anthony finally said, "starting tomorrow, I'm going on vacation. You stay here for me. I'm going to the sea with Brittany. She's never been there before, and I need to rest." "Get a grip," Jack protested. "Your family is falling apart, and you're going on vacation with your mistress? What's wrong with you?" "It's none of your business," Anthony said. "You'd better keep an eye on things here while I'm gone." Anthony threw away the cigarette, started the car, and drove off to Brittany. Jack shook his head and walked home, inwardly shuddering at his friend's actions. The next day, Anthony took his mistress to the sea to relax and get revenge, while his faithful wife was left alone with their 2 children. 10 days later, in the village, Jack enthusiastically hugged his brother. "Hey, bro," he slapped Charles on the shoulders. "How long has it been since we've seen each other?" "A couple of years, probably." Charles smiled. Jack looked at his cousin's shiny car. "Nice ride," he said, admiringly touching the sleek wing of the black BMW. "Thanks," Charles replied modestly. "Business is going well, so I can afford it." Good for you, Jack said, pointing to his own Ford, which had seen better days. I'm still on the same old horse. Not bad either, Charles said, touching the worn handles. Susan clapped her hands. Oh, men will always be men, ready to talk about cars. Charles, come in. We don't promise museums and restaurants here, of course, but we guarantee good fishing and a warm welcome. The men obediently entered the house while Susan quickly set the table. Out of courtesy, she sat with them for half an hour before heading to her friend's house to discuss her husband's brother, whom she believed to be a very worthy man. At Chloe's house, Susan sat in the kitchen and vividly described the guest, sharing everything she had learned from him and her husband. He's a good person, but unlucky in his personal life, she said in the end. Unlucky? Chloe asked indifferently. Despite Susan's efforts, the suitor's candidacy failed to impress her. She listened half-heartedly, her thoughts elsewhere. When he shared his last love, I felt so sorry for him, Susan said. Although with his money, he could buy anyone. You can't buy love, Chloe replied. That's true too, Susan agreed with a sigh. Do you want to meet him? Chloe laughed. What's so funny? Susan didn't understand. Even if I wanted to, how can I compete with city beauties? Chloe said. Besides, I have 2 children. He said he always dreamed of a normal family, but fell in love with Helen, who turned out to be a cuckoo. She left her child with her mother and went to the capital to build her own life. Yes, it's a pity, Chloe said sincerely, feeling sympathy. Over the past few days, Chloe had changed a lot. It was as if years had passed in a short time. Outwardly, she remained just as attractive, but the spark of interest in life had disappeared from her eyes. She kept the house clean, the children well-groomed and fed, and she didn't neglect herself either. She maintained her appearance and avoided gaining extra weight or eating sweets. Despite her resentment, she understood that she was responsible for her 2 young children who were not to blame for their foster father's betrayal. Initially, Chloe had waited for Anthony to return and was even willing to forgive him on the condition that he would leave the mistress and forget her forever. But Anthony didn't come back. He was now at the seaside with his mistress. So, Chloe declined persistent invitations from her friend, saying, I'm not up for new acquaintances right now. Meanwhile, Charles and Jack were riding a motorcycle through the streets, laughing. The villagers looked at them with either smiles or disapproval. Charles, where are you going? Jack yelled, pointing forward. Charles turned the handlebars, but it was too late. The front wheel sank into the brownish-green slush, and the motorcycle tipped over. Both of them fell into the puddle. Where did you learn to drive? Jack shouted. It was my first time on a motorcycle, Charles excused himself. What's going on here? A stern female voice asked. The men turned to see Susan standing with her hands on her hips, glaring at them. Darling, don't be mad. We were just taking a little ride, Jack said. I see you're drunk, Susan retorted. Just a little bit, Jack replied. Charles remained silent, not looking at Susan but rather at the woman standing behind her. Graceful and thin, with a tired look in her brown eyes, she caught his attention. Susan turned to her and said reproachfully, Meet Chloe. This is Charles, the brother of my alcoholic, and apparently, he's an alcoholic too. Hello, Charles said, standing up and shaking off his expensive jeans. You'll excuse us, we've been making some noise. Just haven't seen my brother for a long time. Chloe smiled sadly and pulled out a handkerchief, applying it to Charles's forehead. You're hurt. Come inside. I'll treat your wound, Chloe said, smiling as she showed Charles his scraped elbow. I'm hurt too. I need treatment as well. I'll take care of you at home so you'll remember it for life, Susan teased, pretending to be annoyed. Come on, get your bike and let's head home. Charles and Chloe watched as the motorcycle roared away, carrying the couple up the street. Chloe opened the gate and led Charles inside. She quickly took out gauze and peroxide, treating his scrape. Charles watched her silently, seeming to admire her. You have such soft hands, he noted. Chloe blushed. They're just hands, she replied passively as she finished applying a band-aid. All done. Thank you, Charles said, touching the band-aid on his forehead. Do you live alone with your children? They're at a friend's house right now, Chloe said. And your husband? I don't have a husband, Chloe paused, then added, I don't have a husband anymore. Did you get divorced? Chloe looked into his eyes intently. Charles, it's time for you to go. I have a lot to do. Charles nodded. Yes, sorry for the inappropriate questions. I was just curious. Thank you for treating my wound. Later that evening, Charles asked Jack to tell him more about Chloe. Anthony went to the sea with his mistress, Jack said as he finished his story. Charles shook his head. What a fool I am, he said regretfully. Don't worry. You didn't know, Jack reassured him. So, did you like her? Charles nodded. Yes, but there's one important thing I should mention, Jack said reluctantly. She has 2 adopted children. I don't see any problem with that. It's wonderful, Charles replied thoughtfully. If she has adopted kids, it means she has a kind heart. Jack glanced at his wife, who only smiled faintly. The next morning, Charles woke up early and headed to the nearest town. Charles stood at Chloe's door, holding a gorgeous bouquet of red roses, Belgian chocolates, and French champagne. An hour later, he knocked politely. 2 children came to the door, staring curiously at the guest. Who are you? They asked. I'm Charles, he said with a smile, handing them the box of chocolates. I'm here for your mother. Is she home? The children eagerly grabbed the box and ran inside. Moments later, Chloe appeared in the doorway. As she saw him, she instinctively adjusted her hair and smoothed down her long skirt. Hello, she said. Charles bowed his head politely. I hope I'm not interrupting. I just wanted to see you. Chloe looked surprised. Are you here for something specific? Charles shrugged. I'm just here for you. Meanwhile, Anthony's vacation with Brittany was quickly unraveling. As soon as they arrived at the hotel, Brittany, who had seemed so charming, turned into a demanding and unpleasant companion. She complained about not getting a room with a sea view, even though Anthony had paid for a room without one. She pulled back the curtains, nagged about the conditions, and argued with the hotel staff over trivial matters. Her dissatisfaction didn't end there. She complained about the noise from the air conditioner, walked around to check on neighboring rooms, and annoyed other guests. Brittany even criticized the beach and the sea, calling them unclean and unpleasant. Her behavior escalated to the point where she poisoned herself with something from the hotel restaurant and spent 2 days in the room, hugging the toilet. Anthony was at his wit's end. He had traded Chloe for this experience, and now he was regretting it. He couldn't believe he had left Chloe for such a frustrating vacation. When he set a condition for Brittany, either she calmly enjoyed the vacation or he would leave, she took offense and walked out. Anthony spent the entire night searching for her throughout the city, only to find her drunk at a roadside cafe with a group of inebriated men. When he insisted she come back to the hotel, she brazenly smiled and dismissed him. When the argument between Brittany and Anthony grew heated, her companions intervened. Anthony returned to the hotel alone, his mood dark and regretful. He cursed Brittany for her frivolity and himself for giving in to weakness. Determined to make amends, he resolved to beg for forgiveness from his wife, fully confident that he could win her back. After landing, he took the truck from the airport parking lot and drove home. As he passed through a small town, he realized it might be better to apologize with gifts. His anger at Brittany had overshadowed this consideration, so he stopped at the first shop he saw and bought the most expensive champagne and box of chocolates he could find. The cashier, a bit puzzled, noted that he was the second person buying such items that day. Leaving the store, Anthony saw a black BMW parked in front of his house and muttered to himself about the coincidence. He pushed open the gate, clutching the champagne and chocolates, and entered his yard. The sound of his wife's laughter mixed with an unfamiliar man's laughter reached him. Inside, the guest was seated at the kitchen table, sipping tea, while Chloe smiled across from him. The atmosphere grew tense as Anthony walked in, his face a mix of anger and confusion. How should I interpret this? Anthony growled, glaring at his wife and then at the guest. He dropped the champagne and chocolates on the floor in frustration. I don't owe you an explanation, Chloe said calmly. You don't have the right to question me after everything you've done. Anthony, caught off guard by her calmness and the presence of the guest, could only frown and seethe. Charles, remaining composed, looked at Anthony with a touch of mockery. And who are you? I'm the one who has every right to be here, Anthony snarled. I'm her husband. I don't recognize you. Chloe stood up, positioning herself between Anthony and Charles. Soon, I won't be your wife, she said firmly to Anthony. We're getting a divorce. I hope you won't object. I object, Anthony shouted, his anger escalating. We'll see about that. Chloe's eyes narrowed. You're the one who took a mistress and ran off to the sea. I'm glad you're gone. Now, I'd appreciate it if you'd just leave. Charles felt uncomfortable, not frightened by Anthony's outburst, but awkwardly out of place in this personal confrontation. He shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to handle the escalating tension. Anthony, can I talk to you? Charles said firmly, urging him to step outside. Anthony's response was a torrent of curses that left Chloe with no choice but to push him out of the house. He stormed to his car and drove away, still fuming. Charles turned to Chloe with a serious expression. Are you going through with the divorce? Absolutely, Chloe replied quietly. Charles looked at her with a hint of admiration. I'm glad, he said, taking her hand, which smelled of lavender soap. He kissed it gently, making Chloe blush and quickly withdraw her hand. You've only known me for a short time, Chloe said hesitantly. I've met many men and thought I was in love before, but meeting you made me realize what real love feels like. Later, as Chloe washed the dishes with a smile, she found herself reminiscing about her childhood. She remembered the village summers with her parents and the boy who left flowers under her gate, never looking back. She found an old letter from him, pressed it to her chest, and cried. She missed Anthony, but his betrayal was unforgivable. Charles seemed sincere, and she hoped time would reveal her true feelings. 3 months later, Chloe and Charles strolled through the capital's main street with 2 children in tow. The kids were wide-eyed with wonder, and Chloe and Charles walked in comfortable silence, simply enjoying each other's company. Charles broke the silence. How about we talk about getting married again? I'm still recovering from the divorce, Chloe replied with a smile. I can still hear Anthony's curses ringing in my ears. Anthony had made multiple attempts to win Chloe back, begging, pleading, threatening, and even blackmailing her with the children. Each visit made her more determined to move on. Charles, now back in the city, offered Anthony a large sum of money for the house in exchange for agreeing to the divorce. Anthony demanded more, and Charles proposed that Chloe move into his city apartment and leave the house to Anthony. Chloe agreed, relieved to have nothing left for her in the village. The divorce was finalized quickly. Chloe heard from Mrs. Blake that Brittany had returned to her village and found work at a poultry farm, with none of her grand plans coming to fruition. Charles reassured Chloe, forget about him. You left the house and him behind. Now, you're here with me and the children. That's what matters. Chloe nodded and smiled. The autumn sky, once gloomy and overcast, brightened as the sun peeked out from behind the clouds. It reflected off the wet cobblestones, glinted in the windows, and illuminated the square with golden light. Chloe felt a sense of joy and renewal, as if the clouds in her soul had finally cleared and the long-awaited sun had arrived.